Conclusion of the book, The Explorer by Somerset Maugham. 21. The days went by, spent by Alec in making necessary preparations for his journey, spent by Lucy in sickening anxiety. The last 2 months had been passed by her in a conflict of emotions. Love had planted itself in her heart like a great forest tree, and none of the storms that had assailed it seemed to have power to shake its stubborn roots. Season, common decency, shame had lost their power. She had prayed God that a merciful death might free her from the dreadful uncertainty. She was spiritless and cowed. She despised herself for her weakness, and sometimes she rebelled against the fate that crushed her with such misfortunes. She had tried to do her duty always, acting humbly according to her lights, and yet everything she was concerned in crumbled away to powder at her touch. She, too, began to think that she was not meant for happiness. She knew that she ought to hate Alec, but she could not. She knew that his actions should fill her with nameless horror, but against her will she could not believe that he was false and wicked. One thing she was determined on, and that was to keep her word to Robert Bulger, but he himself gave her back her freedom. He came to her one day, and after a little casual conversation, broke suddenly into the middle of things. "Lucy, I want to ask you to release me from my engagement to you," he said. Her heart gave a great leap against her breast, and she began to tremble. He went on. "I'm ashamed to have to say it. I find that I don't love you enough to marry you." She looked at him silently, and her eyes filled with tears. The brutality with which he spoke was so unnatural that it betrayed the mercifulness of his intention. "If you think that, there is nothing more to be said," she answered. He gave her a look of such bitterness that she felt it impossible to continue a pretense which deceived neither of them. "I'm unworthy of your love," she cried. "I've made you desperately wretched." "It doesn't matter about me," he said, "but there's no reason for you to be wretched too." "I'm willing to do whatever you wish, Bobby." "I can't marry you simply because you're sorry for me. I thought I could, but it's asking too much of you. We had better say no more about it." "I'm very sorry," she whispered. "You see, you're still in love with Alec Mackenzie." He said it, vainly longing for a denial, but he knew in his heart that no denial would come. "I always shall be, notwithstanding everything. I can't help myself." "No, it's fate." She sprang to her feet with vehement passion. "Oh, Bobby, don't you think there's some chance that everything may be explained?" He hesitated for a moment. It was very difficult to answer. "It's only fair to tell you that now things have calmed down. There are a great many people who don't believe McInnery's story. It appears that the man's a thorough blackguard whom Mackenzie loaded with benefits." "Do you still believe that Alec caused George's death?" "Yes." Lucy leaned back in her chair, resting her face on her hand. She seemed to reflect deeply. "And you?" said Bobby. She gave him a long, earnest look. The color came to her cheeks. "No," she said firmly. "Why not?" he asked. "I have no reason, except that I love him." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Bobby got up, kissed her gently, and went out. She did not see him again, and in a day or two she heard that he had gone away. Lucy made up her mind that she must see Alec before he went, but a secret bashfulness prevented her from writing to him. She was afraid that he would refuse, and she could not force herself upon him if she knew definitely that he did not want to see her. But with all her heart, she wanted to ask his pardon. It would not be so hard to continue with the dreary burden which was her life if she knew that he had a little pity for her. He could not fail to forgive her when he saw how broken she was. But the days followed one another, and the date which Julia, radiant with her own happiness, had given her as that of his departure, was approaching. Julia, too, was exercised in mind. After her conversation with Alec, she could not ask him to see Lucy, for she knew what his answer would be. No arguments would move him. He did not want to give either Lucy or himself the pain which he foresaw an interview would cause, and his wounds were too newly healed for him to run any risks. Julia resolved to take the matter into her own hands. Alec was starting next day, and he had promised to look in towards the evening to bid them goodbye. Julia wrote a note to Lucy, asking her to come also. When she told Dick, he was aghast. "But it's a monstrous thing to do," he cried. "You can't entrap the man in that way." "I know it's monstrous," she answered. "But that's the only advantage of being an American in England, that one can do monstrous things. You look upon us as first cousins to the Red Indians, and you expect anything from us. In America, I have to mind my P's and Q's. I mayn't smoke in public, I shouldn't dream of lunching in a restaurant alone with a man, and I'm the most conventional person in the most conventional society in the world. But here, because the English are under the delusion that New York society is free and easy, and that American women have no restraint, I can kick over the traces, and no one will think it even odd." "But, my dear, it's a mere matter of common decency." "There are times when common decency is out of place," she replied. "Alec will never forgive you." "I don't care. I think he ought to see Lucy, and since he'd refuse if I asked him, I'm not going to give him the chance." "What will you do if he just bows and walks off?" "I have his assurance that he'll behave like a civilized man," she answered. "I wash my hands of it," said Dick. "I think it's perfectly indefensible." "I never said it wasn't," she agreed. "But you see, I'm only a poor, weak woman, and I'm not supposed to have any sense of honor or propriety. You must let me take what advantage I can of the disabilities of the weaker sex." Dick smiled and shrugged his shoulders. "Your blood be upon your own head," he answered. "If I perish, I perish." And so it came about that when Alec had been 10 minutes in Julia's cozy sitting room, Lucy was announced. Julia went up to her, greeting her effusively to cover the awkwardness of the moment. Alec grew very pale, but made no sign that he was disconcerted. Only Dick was troubled. He was obviously at a loss for words, and it was plain to see that he was out of temper. "I'm so glad you were able to come," said Julia, in order to show Alec that she had been expecting Lucy. Lucy gave him a rapid glance, and the color flew to her cheeks. He was standing up and came forward with outstretched hand. "How do you do?" he said. "How is Lady Kelsey?" "She's much better, thanks. We've been to Spa, you know, for her health." Julia's heart beat quickly. She was much excited at this meeting, and it seemed to her strangely romantic, a sign of the civilization of the times, that these two people with raging passions afire in their hearts should exchange the commonplaces of polite society. Alec, having recovered from his momentary confusion, was extremely urbane. "Somebody told me you'd gone abroad," he said. "Was it you, Dick?" Dick is an admirable person, a sort of gazetteer for the world of fashion. Dick fussily brought forward a chair for Lucy to sit in and offered to disembarrass her of the jacket she was wearing. "You must make my excuses for not leaving a card on Lady Kelsey before going away," said Alec. "I've been excessively busy." "It doesn't matter at all," Lucy answered. Julia glanced at him. She saw that he was determined to keep the conversation on the indifferent level which it might have occupied if Lucy had been nothing more than an acquaintance. There was a bantering tone in his voice which was an effective barrier to all feeling. For a moment, she was nonplussed. "London is an excellent place for showing one of how little importance one is in the world. One makes a certain figure, and perhaps is tempted to think oneself of some consequence. Then one goes away, and on returning is surprised to discover that nobody has ever noticed one's absence." Lucy smiled faintly. Dick, recovering his good humor, came at once to the rescue. "You're over-modest, Alec. If you weren't, you might be a great man. Now, I make a point of telling my friends that I'm indispensable, and they take me at my word. You are a leaven of flippancy in the heavy dough of British righteousness, smiled Alec. It is true that the wise man only takes the unimportant quite seriously. For it is obvious that one needs more brains to do nothing with elegance than to be a cabinet minister, said Alec. You pay me a great compliment, Alec, cried Dick. You repeat to my very face one of my favourite observations. Julia looked at him steadily. Haven't I heard you say that only the impossible is worth doing? Good heavens, he cried. I must have been quoting the headings of a copybook. Lucy felt that she must say something. She had been watching Alec, and her heart was nearly breaking. She turned to Dick. Are you going down to Southampton? She asked. I am indeed, he answered. I shall hide my face on Alec's shoulder and weep salt tears. It will be most affecting, because in moments of emotion, I always burst into epigram. Alec sprang to his feet. There was a bitterness in his face, which was in odd contrast with Dick's light words. I loathe all solemn leave-takings, he said. I prefer to part from people with a nod or a smile, whether I'm going for ever or for a day to Brighton. And I've always assured you that you're a monster of inhumanity, said Mrs. Lomas, laughing difficultly. He turned to her with a grim smile. Dick has been imploring me for 20 years to take life flippantly. I have learnt at last that things are only grave if you take them gravely, and that is desperately stupid. It's so hard to be serious without being absurd. That is the chief power of women, that life and death for them are merely occasions for a change of costume, marriage, a creation in white, and the worship of God, an opportunity for a Paris bonnet. Julia saw that he was determined to keep the conversation on a level of amiable persiflage, and with her lively sense of the ridiculous, she could hardly repress a smile at the heaviness of his hand. Through all that he said pierced the bitterness of his heart, and his every word was contradicted by the vehemence of his tortured voice. She was determined, too, that the interview which she had brought about, uncomfortable as it had been to all of them, should not be brought to nothing. Characteristically, she went straight to the point. She stood up. I'm sure you two have things to say to one another that you would like to say alone. She saw Alec's eyes grow darker as he saw himself cornered, but she was implacable. I have some letters to send off by the American mail, and I want Dick to look over them to see that I've spelt honor with a U and traveller with a double L. Neither Alec nor Lucy answered, and the determined little woman took her husband firmly away. When they were left alone, neither spoke for a while. I've just realized that you didn't know I was coming today, said Lucy at last. I had no idea that you were being entrapped. I would never have consented to that. I'm very glad to have an opportunity of saying goodbye to you, he answered. He preserved the conversational manner of polite society, and it seemed to Lucy that she would never have the strength to get beyond. I'm so glad that Dick and Julia are happily married. They're very much in love with one another. I should have thought love was the worst possible foundation for marriage, he answered. Love creates illusions, and marriage destroys them. True lovers should never marry. Again, silence fell upon them, and again Lucy broke it. You're going away tomorrow? I am. She looked at him, but he would not meet her eyes. He went over to the window and looked out upon the busy street. Are you very glad to go? You can't think what a joy it is to look upon London for the last time. I long for the infinite surface of the clean and comfortable sea. Lucy gave a stifled sob. Alec started a little, but he did not move. He still looked down upon the stream of cabs and buses lit by the misty autumn sun. Is there no one you regret to leave, Alec? It tore his heart that she should use his name. To hear her say it had always been like a caress, and the word on her lips brought back once more the whole agony of his distress. But he would not allow his emotion to be seen. He turned round and faced her gravely. Now, for the first time, he did not hesitate to look at her, and while he spoke the words he set himself to speak, he noticed the exquisite oval of her face, her charming, soft hair, and her unhappy eyes. You see, Dick is married, and so I'm much best out of the way. When a man takes a wife, his bachelor friends are wise to depart from his life gracefully before he shows them that he needs their company no longer. And besides Dick, I have few friends and no relations. I can't flatter myself that anyone will be much distressed at my departure. You must have no heart at all, she said in a low, hoarse voice. He clenched his teeth. He was bitterly angry with Julia because she had exposed him to this unspeakable torture. If I had, I certainly should not bring it to the Carlton Hotel. That sentimental organ would be surely out of place in such a neighborhood. Lucy sprang to her feet. Oh, why do you treat me as if we were strangers? How can you be so cruel? Flippancy is often the only refugee from an uncomfortable position, he answered gravely. We should really be much wiser merely to discuss the weather. Are you angry because I came? That would be very ungracious on my part. Perhaps it wasn't quite necessary that we should meet again. You've been acting all the time I've been here. Do you think I didn't see it was unreal when you talked with such cynical indifference? I know you well enough to tell when you're hiding your real self behind a mask. If that is so, the inference is obvious that I wish my real self to be hidden. I would rather you cursed me than treat me with such cold politeness. I'm afraid you're rather difficult to please, he said. Lucy went up to him passionately, but he drew back so that she might not touch him. Her outstretched hands dropped powerless to her side. Oh, you're of iron, she cried pitifully. Alec, Alec, I couldn't let you go without seeing you once more. Even you would be satisfied if you knew what bitter anguish I've suffered. Even you would pity me. I don't want you to think too badly of me. Does it much matter what I think? We shall be 5,000 miles apart. You must utterly despise me. He shook his head. And now his manner lost that affected calmness which had been so cruelly wounding. He could not now attempt to hide the pain that he was suffering. His voice trembled a little with his great emotion. I loved you far too much to do that. Believe me, with all my heart, I wish you well. Now that the first bitterness is past, I see that you did the only possible thing. I hope that you'll be very happy. Robert Boulger is an excellent fellow, and I'm sure he'll make you a much better husband than I should ever have done. Lucy blushed to the roots of her hair. Her heart sank, and she did not seek to conceal her agitation. Did they tell you I was going to marry Robert Boulger? Isn't it true? Oh, how cruel of them! How frightfully cruel! I became engaged to him, but he gave me my release. He knew that notwithstanding everything, I loved you better than my life. Alec looked down, but he did not say anything. He did not move. Oh, Alec, don't be utterly pitiless, she wailed. Don't leave me without a single word of kindness. Nothing has changed, Lucy. You sent me away because I caused your brother's death. She stood before him, her hands behind her back, and they looked into one another's eyes. Her words were steady and quiet. It seemed to give her an infinite relief to say them. I hated you then, and yet I couldn't crush the love that was in my heart. And it's because I was frightened of myself that I told Bobby I'd marry him. But I couldn't. I was horrified because I cared for you still. It seemed such odious treachery to George, and yet love burnt up my heart. I used to try and drive you away from my thoughts, but every word you had ever said came back to me. Don't you remember you told me that everything you did was for my sake? Those words hammered away on my heart as though it were an anvil. I struggled not to believe them. I said to myself that you had sacrificed George coldly, callously, prudently, but my love told me it wasn't true. Your whole life stood on one side and only this hateful story on the other. You couldn't have grown into a different man in one single instant. I've learnt to know you better during these 3 months of utter misery, and I'm ashamed of what I did. Ashamed? I came here today to tell you that I don't understand the reason of what you did, but I don't want to understand. I believe in you now with all my strength. I believe in you as better women than I believe in God. I know that whatever you did was right and just because you did it. Alec looked at her for a moment, then he held out his hand. Thank God, he said. I'm so grateful to you. Have you nothing more to say to me than that? You see, it's come too late. Nothing much matters now, for tomorrow I go away forever. But you'll come back. He gave a short, scornful laugh. They were so glad to give me that job on the Congo because no one else would take it. I'm going to a part of Africa from which Europeans seldom return. Oh, that's too horrible, she cried. Don't go, dearest, I can't bear it. I must now. Everything is settled, and there can be no drawing back. She let go hopelessly of his hand. Don't you care for me any more? She whispered. He looked at her, but he did not answer. She turned away and, sinking into a chair, began to cry. Don't, Lucy, he said, his voice breaking suddenly. Don't make it harder. Oh, Alec, Alec, don't you see how much I love you? He leaned over her and gently stroked her hair. Be brave, darling, he whispered. She looked up passionately, seizing both his hands. I can't live without you. I've suffered too much. If you cared for me at all, you'd stay. Though I love you with all my soul, I can't do otherwise now than go. Then take me with you, she cried eagerly. Let me come too. You. You don't know what I can do. With you to help me, I can be very brave. Let me come, Alec. It's impossible. You don't know what you ask. Then let me wait for you. Let me wait till you come back. And if I never come back, I will wait for you still. He placed his hands on her shoulders and looked into her eyes, as though he were striving to see into the depths of her soul. She felt very weak. She could scarcely see him through her tears, but she tried to smile. Then, without a word, he slipped his arms around her. Sobbing in the ecstasy of her happiness, she let her head fall on his shoulder. You will have the courage to wait, he said. I know you love me, and I trust you. Then have no fear. I will come back. My journey was only dangerous because I wanted to die. I want to live now, and I shall live. Oh, Alec, Alec, I'm so glad you love me. Outside in the street, the bells of the motor buses tinkled noisily, and there was an incessant roar of the traffic that rumbled heavily over the wooden pavements. There was a clatter of horses' hooves and the blowing of horns. The electric broughams whizzed past with an odd, metallic whir. The end.